Hi, I'm going to do a quick lecture, video lecture, going through the sweatshops information that I've posted as a Word document. Let's see how this works, see if you like this. We're here at our website page, our Blackboard page, and this is our announcement page here, and you can see these are announcements, just to remind you where we are. And I'm going to Unit 2, and this is how it would look on your page. This is how it would look on your page. Here's Module 1, and there's the reading assignment. And I'm going to go through these links. These are links that you had on your syllabus, but then I'm also going to go through my lecture. So where's my lecture? Here's the lecture as a Word document. And you just click on this and download it, and you'll see something that looks like this. There's the overview of sweatshops and anti-sweatshop action. And that's what I'm going to go through with you right now. So it starts out with talking about the definition of sweatshops. And I look at the legal, historical, as well as detail some more of the historical information on sweating. And that was something that came out of the 15th century as a metaphor for describing the severe exertion of labor. So in the 19th century, sweating was used to describe the system of subcontracting by which competing manufacturers farmed work out to contractors, and they in turn farmed their work out to subcontractors. And that's not unlike what it actually is today. It used to be that work was subcontracted out to women working in their homes, when it comes especially to textiles and garment making. But now it's their small shops, and in a way, we've come full circle. So we still do have factories, but we'll be talking about how things have changed over time. And then, of course, the emphasis here is on the garment industry and apparel, but there are sweatshops in many different industries. You can even say sometimes that there are teaching sweatshops or office sweatshops when people are really compelled to work long hours for low pay with little rights. So that's basically the idea. But our attention here is going to be mainly on the garment industry. And you know, the other thing I wrote here was about human rights, because it's hard to talk about an absolute standard of labor standards. In general, you know, for example, we talk about not seeing, that children should have childhood, that they shouldn't be working when they're very young. That we've come to the point where we consider the minimum age of working part-time should be about in their teens sometime. Full-time should be later. And yet we know that many families do, in the United States even, do ask their kids to work. Hopefully that they're still allowed to go to school. But in countries around the world, families oftentimes can't support themselves without having their children work too. So it's hard to have a constant standard that you can apply everywhere, whether it's for child labor or whether it's for the hours that people work. But on the other hand, there is a question of human rights and workers' rights. And that's really at the bottom of the push for labor standards, and the idea that workers should have the right to organize and set their standards based on negotiating for themselves. All right, here we go. So I'm moving on to look at the apparel. One other thing I wanted to just say, in some of these different places, I've got links also. So I'm going to look at those briefly. this is my lecture, but let's look for a moment at the links that I posted on, this is the first link, Poor Workplace Conditions Lead Ladies to Strike. I believe that's the first link in your syllabus that's for this module. So I'm looking at the syllabus right now. I'm coming down to Unit 2, Module 1, and I'm asking you to read the book, Students Against Sweatshops, The Making of a Movement, as well as I asked you to look through these websites. So the first one was xroadsvirginia.edu. So I think that's what this is right here, Xroads. So this is Poor Workplace Conditions Lead Ladies to Strike, and this refers to the uprising of the 10,000 back in the 1909, when 20,000 shirtwaist makers, the manufacturers of popular ladies' blouses, walked out of work. And they walked out of work because their wages were cut and their hours were shortened, but they couldn't survive when their wages were cut as well. So these were mainly Jewish and Italian workers who went out on strike. And it's pretty amazing to see, for example, this hall filled with women workers listening to the leaders speak. And again, in the syllabus, I've got the next one is the triangle fire. So I'll come back to my lecture in a minute, but I gave you some other things to look at. The triangle fire. So this was the triangle fire that happened in 1911. This was after the uprising of the 10,000 in 1909, where unions were operating, the International Ladies Garment Worker Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers were trying to help organize workers. And this is a picture of the building of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory and what the owners did. And these were largely, again, Jewish and Italian workers and Jewish owners of the factory. They locked the doors. They locked the doors to the fire escape. So 146 women perished by either being asphyxiated or jumping to their death. And that led to a number of different fire laws and safety laws being made. I move on to the Lawrence textile strike. This is men and women who were met with the militia. Here you see a picture of Harper's Weekly in 1913. Once again, this was about a pay cut and wages being cut. And once again, thousands of workers went out on strike. And they actually were helped by the International Workers of the World, which was a union that tried to organize all workers, not just the craft workers or skilled workers. And they, it took them several months to be victorious. And during that time, their leaders from the IWW were actually jailed, and there had to be a big campaign to get them out of jail. The children in the schools were harassed, so workers actually sent their children to New York to get out of town from Lawrence, Massachusetts during the strike. So we see this history of workers trying to fight sweatshop conditions. More recently, the Ferris strike in 1972 was largely Mexican-American workers who struck in Texas. And this is when, once again, they were feeling that, they were trying to organize. There were men and women who were involved in this strike. And many of them were harassed, fired. They were replaced by workers from El Paso and from across the border from Ciudad Juarez. But there was a national boycott, and a lot of people came together to support the workers. So they did get a union contract, but the struggle continued, and eventually there were plant closures that hurt the workers. So it hasn't been easy in the apparel industry in particular, where they have the subcontracting, the outsourcing, and again, we'll come back to this history, bringing it more up to the present. This is the American History, si.edu. Here are sweatshops overview, definitions, El Monte. So this is right here, this is actually a museum that you can walk through, and it tells you kind of the history and, bringing it up to the present. And it talks about the El Monte raid. And this is when 72 illegal Thai immigrants had been forced to work in virtual captivity. And I actually met these workers. I was doing a labor project around women who work in construction. And one of the women who was working at the Thai factory had also been a construction worker. She'd worked with pipes in Thailand. So I was taken to the place where the workers were staying after they had been released from captivity. And really, they were kept there for years, passports taken away, barbed wire around this house, threatened if they made any move to contact their relatives, etc. It was only by a fluke that they were able to get attention from the outside, and people worked on their behalf to liberate them. So it was very moving to meet the folks that had been suffering under these conditions. This was in 1995, and you'll see that triggered much more awareness about sweatshops in the United States today. Okay, so I finished by talking about Made in LA and in the syllabus, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of my lecture. All right, so back to, this is the sweatshop in LA, overview of sweatshops and sweatshop action. I talked about the definition of sweatshop. The legal definition is the employer that violates more than one federal or state law governing minimum wage and overtime, child labor, industrial homework, occupational safety and health, workers' compensation, or industrial regulation. So under that regard, there's a lot of different companies that unfortunately could qualify as sweatshops. But again, we're looking particularly at the garment industry. So I wanted to mark here the fight for the 8-hour day, since the hours of work is something that's very important. And this is the, it's actually not the right. Let's see if I can quickly find where I've got that. Let's go back to the syllabus here. So, in the 19th century, I've already, let's see, in terms of the fight for the 8-hour day, what I'll do is I'll just open this up again, and I'm going to start a new link, put this in, and this is the brief origins of May Day. This is the modern IWW, Industrial Worker for the World website, and it talks about what were the brief origins of May Day. So back in Chicago in 1886, if you take a look at this website, you'll see that workers were trying to fight for an 8-hour day, and hundreds of thousands of them were demonstrating. This is the beginning of the May 1st celebration, which is still celebrated as the International Workers' Day around the world. And we celebrate it at Dominguez for our labor fair as well. But this is when workers were framed by the police in Chicago for supposedly causing a riot when someone threw dynamite into a crowd, and there were a number of people that were killed, and they arrested the leaders of the organizing committee who weren't even there at the time. So, again, this is something you can read about, but I thought this was an important point to mark as the struggle of workers trying to get fair treatment. And it's something that was taken up in the early 19th century by the shirtwaist makers. And what happened is really that the courts in the United States fought on the side, they made judgments on the side of companies against the workers, saying workers have the right not to work in that company if they don't want to work the hours that are needed. And there was a big struggle. And first, women were granted, after they fought for it, the 10-hour day, and then it was some time before it was extended to men too. And we're still fighting for fair hours, even again once today. So I go on in my lecture sheet here to go back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which I've mentioned, which is where the uprising of the 20,000 occurred in New York. And this is the first protocol of peace was one of the model collective bargaining agreements that had been fashioned by workers together with a future Supreme Court Judge, Brandeis. I mentioned the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and then the codes that came into New York after this tragedy occurred. Jumping forward to the 1930s, the New Deal legislation, which came up with the Wagner Act in 1935 that granted most workers the right to organize, except for domestic workers and agricultural workers, which is something that really helped solidify and institutionalize the stratification of racism and racial conflict in our country, because the majority of people who were working in the fields at that time and working as domestic workers were black and brown people. But it was a milestone for creating the right for workers to organize. The next thing I mark in the lecture is the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, and this was something that, so here it's the Fair Labor Standards Act is something which helped to ban oppressive child labor and set the minimum hourly wage at 25 cents and the maximum work week at 44 hours a week. And let's see if I can find that. Let's see. Well, let's see. I've come back to this. All right, I'll try to get that back. Okay. I think I'll just do this. So that I was trying to cite the place that I found the information, just so that if you're interested, you can go to the United States Department of Labor and look up the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This was the struggle for the minimum wage. Moving on, in the global, I was then moving to the question of looking at how, from 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act, this was just before the World War II. And after World War II, two important institutions were created, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And these were created so that Europe and the United States would have a hand in in really the economic development around the world and what were the former colonial possessions of predominantly Europe at the time and the places where the United States was to have an influence. And the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank really started creating in the 1940s and then even further in the 1950s and 60s a movement to try to get many of the third world countries, these former colonial places like the Middle East, the Southeast Asia, Latin America, to start building factories and creating platforms, so they call them export platforms, where they would be able to develop industry, which was supposed to develop their economy, but it also coincided with the idea that this is a place where there could be investment from Europe and the United States into third world countries, the global south, as people say. And this is something that started getting bigger and bigger. In the 1960s and 70s, there really was more of a move of American companies and European companies to close shop in the United States, where there were stronger unions and stronger standards, as we see labor standards and environmental standards, and move to many of these other countries where factories were established with tax incentives, etc. So my next point in the lecture is that globalization and the attack on labor in the U.S. since the 1970s meant the rise of sweatshops internationally. So maybe I can try to make this a little bit bigger. Oops. All right. So I'm just talking about this number 5, globalization and the attack on labor in the U.S. since the 1970s means the rise in sweatshops, and that's around the world. So, looking at this, we note that now in the United States, many of the factories and have shut down, have either moved to the South or in the United States, but even more so to Mexico, to Central America, and to Asia, to China. And, these are kind of large changes, large shifts in the economy. But the upshot of that is that, as we know, if you look at many of the pieces of the garments that we wear, most of them are made overseas. So where we used to be made in the U.S., and possibly with union labor, a lot of the garments are made overseas under sweatshop conditions. So I've pointed out here, according to New York University American Studies professor Andrew Ross, more than 60% of the garments now sold in the U.S. are imported, mostly from Asian countries. And this has probably even gone up. So in 1970, it was only about $1 billion worth of products that were sold in the U.S. that were made abroad. Now it's $42 billion worth of products. And we see also, Walmart has had an effect in creating certain kinds of labor standards and working conditions under which the companies really have to conform to in order to get their sales back to Walmart. So Walmart affects the Chinese, or in particular, but other countries, in getting those contractors and subcontractors to pay very little and in order to then ensure them a contract that they will buy their merchandise and then sell it back in the United States. And I've pulled up here an interview with Edna Bonasich, who's a sociologist who teaches at UC Riverside. And she explains some of the information about Walmart, if you want to read more about that. All right. So I move on to talk about, one of our points that I had discussed was what's happening now in the United States. So sweatshops have made a comeback, even though the majority of our garments are made overseas. There are now factories and subcontractors who work in the United States. And a film was made not long ago called Made in LA, and it's worth looking at their website. Again, no more sweatshops. Immigrants have rights too. And this is where immigrants are taken advantage of. And I'll just enlarge this, and you can take a look at hopefully the Made in LA trailer. I'm not having any luck right now, but here we go. So this is just the trailer. This movie is actually available in the library, and it's a really good film about workers who organize to try to make a difference.
Solo sabíamos lo que teníamos que hacer.
Teníamos miedo, pero no podíamos dejar que el miedo los paralizara. No nos quedaba otra opción más de que luchar.
So take a look at that when you can. The director actually came to Dominguez Hills when we showed the film, and some of the workers came to talk to us too several years ago. At any rate, there's a lot of very fine documentaries about the problems that workers face, but Made in LA is a really excellent one, and I urge you to take a look at it, and if you want to, for extra credit, you can write about it as well. And it shows how undocumented immigrants and immigrants who have come here with green cards or become citizens really still are targeted for sweatshop labor. And so I'm moving on now to the anti-sweatshop actions. So the Students Against Sweatshops was formed in the 1990s, right after the El Monte sweatshop was exposed in 1995. Many universities contract with non-union manufacturers who produce products with college insignia under sweatshop conditions, with big profits for contractors and even for universities. So now we're zeroing in on the institutions like universities who actually work with sweatshops overseas, oftentimes in Central America. And, this is something that is happening at the CSU campuses too, where our bookstore is part of a corporation, the Follett, E-Follett, I think it's called. And it's very interesting to see, if you look at the labels in the garments that are sold in bookstores like our own university, to think they're very expensive. Who's making that profit? Where's that going to? And an institution such as our university can have a big effect on demanding that there be decent conditions, and that the workers who are in these shops making these products make a decent wage. So that's what Students Against Sweatshops was working on, and you're reading about that in the textbook. So the initial reaction to Students Against Sweatshops in the 1990s under Clinton was to create the FLA, the Fair Labor Association, which was where the manufacturers volunteered to join them and have a code of conduct. But it was quickly found out that this voluntary association really there was no implementation, there was no enforcement, no monitoring. So the next idea was to create this Workers' Rights Consortium. And you can take a look at the webpage there. And the idea there is that the Workers' Rights Consortium works with workers themselves who provide information, and the universities and the institutions belong to this, together with a number of different student alliances, and they help to find out where workers are organizing and making claims on their employers, and try to make sure that the garments that the universities buy are made under decent working conditions. So again, take a look at this webpage. This is what the Students Against Sweatshops are trying to encourage universities to do. So they work also with Unite Here, which is an American union that tries to organize workers in the United States. So they represent workers not only in the garment industry, but also in another number of other industries. So some of the college campus campaigns include, through the WRC, the Workers' Rights Consortium, is to try to get bookstores to buy garments made by Alta Gracia, which is a factory in the Dominican Republic. And you can read about that struggle at the webpage that I've noted on our website. This is Alta Gracia workers coming to the United States. They're actually, this is September 2011, when the workers from the Dominican Republic were visiting here in the United States. And then the Alta Gracia story. Once again, you can read more about it if you click on the links. And there's some other campaigns that you can see that Students Against Sweatshops are involved in if you go to their webpage and look at some of their campaigns. Okay, I'm going to upload this, and hopefully you'll find this interesting. Let me know if you like this flip lecture style. Thanks. Bye-bye.